Good morning, class. It is Thursday, March 26th. This is your Old Testament class. Our topic today is the Conquest of Jerusalem. Now, last Tuesday, we read about the deaths of King Saul and Jonathan. What I didn't point out, and I would really like to now, is that there were two accounts of their deaths. One was in the latter chapter of 1 Samuel, which was the actual account on the battlefield. The other was in the first chapter of 2 Samuel, when the Alchemite soldier had witnessed the deaths, then taken the king's crown and his bracelet, hurrying off to King David, and assuming that David would be happy with the news, made himself out to be a hero. So he twists the story, and it doesn't turn out so well for him. Now, instead, David had him killed, saying that he had put the Lord's anointed to death. Something very similar is going to happen in our reading today. After the deaths of King Saul and Jonathan, there was going to be a dispute over who would be king. Now, before I get into that, I want to fill you in on a little bit of Israel's background, the whole nation. So, because of the wars that had taken place during the times of the judges, Israel had become divided and diverse. One part, which we're going to refer to as a nation from here on out, was the nation of Judah. Now, if you remember, Judah was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was considered to be more faithful in the long haul with God. It's also the nation from which David came, and then eventually the Messiah. The 11 other tribes we're going to simply refer to as Israel. That is what it's called. So if you're hearing two different names for this nation, you're not wrong. There were two different names. And later they're going to become even more divided to the point of having separate kings. Okay, now back to this dispute over who would become king after Saul had died. If you remember, on the battlefield, 3 of Saul's sons were killed with him, but he had others. One was named Ishbosheth. Now, much of the nation of Israel supported him as king, but Judah supported David, who had already been anointed by Samuel to be king. So the loyalties with the nation were split for 2 years until Saul's son was murdered, and that's what we're going to read about today. Now, jumping ahead, once David does become king, he's going to need a stronghold. Now, a stronghold is a city that is well protected and fortified against enemy attacks. So there's a city that we call Jerusalem today, right? At one time, it was occupied by the Jebusites, and it was called Jebus. That city was so protected that when the Jebusites learned that David wanted to overtake it, they were not worried at all. As a matter of fact, they even made the comment that all they needed was blind men and lame men to protect their city. So we do know that David was an amazing military strategist, and he did find a way. He and his men entered through the water supply that ran underneath the stronghold. Now, once David overtook the city, he renamed it the City of David. During his reign, David developed it into a much larger urban area, and then later he brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city. Now, David starts to make plans to construct the temple there. However, God was very firm with David and said that that was reserved for his son Solomon to do. So I know that's a lot of history, but I want to add one more thing. In the Old Testament, the city of David is referred to identifying Jerusalem 45 times. However, in the New Testament, it's only used twice. And when it's used to identify the city of Bethlehem. David was from the city of Bethlehem, if you remember, and then also we know that our Christ will be born in the city of Bethlehem. So I hope that doesn't add to your confusion, but helps out a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 chapters from 2 Samuel, it's going to be 4 and 5, and I'm going to read parts of them. I'm taking some information out about wars that we're not talking about today, but please feel free to go back and read these 2 chapters in their entirety so you can get a better understanding of the time. Okay, so beginning with my abridged version. So now Saul's son Ishbosheth had 2 men who were his leaders of raiding bands. One was named Bahanah and the other Rechab. Now Bahanah and Rechab set out for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. They went into the inner part of his house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. They got into the house while he was laying on his bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head. Taking it with them, they traveled all night to take it to David the king. And they said, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged King Saul and his offspring." Now David answered them and said, "Saul is dead." He said, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble. Someone did come to me and say, 'Saul is dead,' and thought that he was bringing me good news. I seized him and put him to death, and that was the reward I gave for him. How much more, when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" So David gave an order, and his men killed them. Now all the tribes of Israel came to David and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" When all of the elders of Israel had come to King David, the king made a covenant with them before the Lord, and they anointed David king over all of Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead, and I'm going to read to you the account of David taking over the city from the Jebusites. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame could ward you off." They thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Then David knew the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of Israel. Okay, so that's all I'm going to read to you today. Please go back and read more if you'd like. But what I want to do before we get into your worksheet is just summarize what we've covered since the children of Israel had crossed over into the promised land. Now, we did start with creation, but that's a long way back. So after they crossed over into the promised land, we go through the time of the judges, where God had anointed people to watch over and to judge them. The last judge was Samuel. This judge anointed both Saul and David. Now, the nation of Israel had cried out to God for a king. They wanted to be like other nations. So God had anointed King Saul to be the first king of Israel. At first, Saul was very obedient to God. Then he became very disobedient. God was displeased, and then he chose King David. King David was a man after God's own heart. He followed him faithfully. After King David, he has a son, Solomon. We all know Solomon. Solomon is the writer of most of our wisdom writings. He is who we're going to start covering next week. And so I'm going to end there. I want you to take your cards that are color-coded. That's your information card. Read it. It sums everything up. Take your worksheet. Fill out the question and answer form, and remember, complete sentences. Just take your question, reword it with your answer. You'll have a complete sentence. Make sure you start with a capital letter and with a end mark. Until then, next week, next Tuesday, we will be back talking about King Solomon. I hope you have a great weekend. Remember to stay home and stay safe. God bless.